Welcome to today's webinar, Getting Started with SQL Server 2016 on Amazon EC2. Our presenter today is Tom Staub. Tom is an SQL Server architect, developer, administrator, and mentor, working primarily with the data engine and SSIS. Today with us, we also have Colin, Scott, Tom, Steve, Lou, and Zlatan serving as our webinar moderators. They'll be engaging with you and answering your questions throughout the presentation while Tom presents. Tom, welcome. The floor is now yours.
This is Tom Staub. I'm a Partner Solutions Architect here at Amazon Web Services, and we're going to talk about Microsoft SQL Server 2016 and ways to use it on AWS. So first, we're going to cover running SQL Server on AWS using Amazon EC2 and Amazon RDS. And then we're going to go over some of the new features in SQL Server 2016. And then finally, we'll take a look at how you can set up an instance using AWS CloudFormation, one of our infrastructure as code options. Okay, so what is Amazon EC2? The Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud is a web service that provides resizable compute capacity in the cloud. It is designed to make web-scale cloud computing easier for developers. But how does it do that? Well, by making available virtual machines where you have full administrative rights, including sysadmin rights in the case of SQL Server. These instances can be initialized and terminated within minutes as needed. License options include the license included as well as BYOL or bring your own license. So what does that mean for SQL Server? Well, to run SQL Server on Amazon EC2, you can purchase an Amazon machine instance known as an AMI that includes Windows and SQL Server, or you can purchase a Windows AMI and install SQL Server yourself. You manage the virtual security and storage, etc. You have admin rights on the machine, as I mentioned earlier, as well as full sysadmin rights. So how does that compare with Amazon RDS? The Amazon Relational Database Service makes it easy to set up, operate, and scale a relational database in the cloud because it is a managed service. You have options that you can control, but the patching, backups, mirroring, etc. can be handled automatically, which makes your job easier. You can focus on what you need to focus on. Automatic host replacement protects you in the event of hardware failure. Amazon RDS is actually available in 6 different database engines. We have Amazon Aurora, which is a cloud-optimized MySQL compatible database, Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, and of course SQL Server. Similar to Amazon EC2, RDS can be, we have license included option as well as the BYOL. So what about SQL Server specifically on RDS? We have, you can have up to 30 databases per instance. As I mentioned before, with the managed service, there are things that normally you'd have to handle yourself that now you don't have to. One of those is there's an option for multi-availability zone deployment for high availability. This is not something you have to manage yourself other than checking a box. Transparent data encryption is supported, as well as using SSL for secure data in transit. We also have our own instance encryption option that is available for all database engines and does not require Enterprise Edition when you're using SQL Server. One of the exciting, relatively new features is we support native SQL Server backup and restore. This can be particularly useful during migrations, but could also be used for a DR scenario. So you can back up your on-prem or EC2 database. You can upload that backup file to an S3 bucket and then restore it to an RDS instance. Likewise, you could back up from Amazon RDS and restore it to EC2 or to on-prem. So just a summary, again, of some of the points we've been talking about. Both EC2 and RDS provide license included options. They both provide BYOL options. With Amazon EC2, you have full control over the instance, whereas RDS, you are giving up some of that control for the ease of use of a managed service. With Amazon EC2, you have the option with your control to set up always-on availability groups for high availability. With RDS, the high availability is managed through the our AWS managed multi-AZ deployment. Just speaking a little more about the failover disaster recovery options, again with EC2 you have the flexibility to span AZs or regions. You can do things like mirroring, always on, transaction log shipping, replication. With RDS, again, it's a managed service. The automatic failover and HA is handled through the multi-AZ deployment. So what about the rest of SQL Server? SQL Server is more than just the database. You have the other services, integration services, reporting, analysis services, SQL agent for scheduling, etc. It's important to understand that Amazon RDS is a managed database engine. So what does that mean? Well, these other pieces like SSIS and SSRS do not run within Amazon RDS because, again, RDS is the database engine, but a lot of these tools are compatible and can be used with RDS. And a great example of that is SSIS. I can create a single SSIS package that includes on-prem data, some data from EC2 instances, as well as data in RDS. And of course, with SSIS, I can include data from SQL Server as well as other databases, all in that same package from all of those sources. Okay, so what about SQL Server 2016? What are some of the new features that we can take advantage of here? Well, first let's talk just for a second about what's not new. What's not new is you still have your Enterprise, Standard, Express, Developer editions that you're familiar with. One very nice thing that I like with 2016 is Microsoft has decided to make the Developer Edition free to anyone. You register with Microsoft and you can download a free copy of the Developer Edition. It's, for those of you who do not know, Developer Edition has all the full power of Enterprise Edition with the caveat that it's only for test and development. It's a great opportunity to learn and practice on your own. The Express Edition, of course, is also free, but much more limited, but it can be used in a production environment. Standard is your sort of baseline paid version, and then, or paid edition, and Enterprise, of course, is the top of line, fully included production edition. For each one of these editions, there are various new features that have been added in 2016. Some of them only available in Enterprise Edition. Some of them available in Standard or Enterprise, and other things like JSON support can you can even have Express Edition. In addition to the improvements in the various services, the installation itself has some nice improvements. Two things in particular. A lot of us have been configuring instant file initialization for many years. It is not included out of the box, but it is recommended in a lot of implementations. Unfortunately, with older versions of SQL Server, the configuration of that was a little cumbersome, having to use group policy after the installation to set up the service account, etc. Now there's just a checkbox as part of the installation. Makes it much simpler. Similarly with TempDB, you no longer have to run your installation and then go back and reconfigure TempDB for multiple files. That is an option within the installation. you can tell it, I want TempDB to span 8 files, for instance. With AWS CloudFormation, we can actually parameterize these options as well as other options, and we can build a configuration INI file that can then be used to manage a configuration installation for us. So let's talk a little bit about that, about using CloudFormation to set up our instance. As I mentioned before, CloudFormation is a DevOps infrastructure as code service. It uses a JSON template, which can be built with our designer or various other tools. You upload and configure to deploy a stack of resources. It supports rollback in the case of failure, and also supports PowerShell. So again, you create your template, you upload it, you then use CloudFormation to create the stack, you fill in your parameters if you're, which is optional, but if you're using parameters, and then it constructs whatever resources you asked it to construct. It could be VPCs or security groups, EC2 instances, etc. This is a very high-level example of sort of the anatomy of a CloudFormation template. Most of the sections are optional, but the resources section is the most important, and it is absolutely not optional. That is where you specify what resources you want to create. You simply tell it what type of resource, you give it a reference ID, and then the properties for that resource. For instance, in this example, we're creating my EC2 instance. The type is, of course, an EC2 instance. And then in this particular case, the properties indicate the image ID for the AMI that we want to use. Again, the Amazon machine instance. And then the instance type tells us what size VM we want that instance to run on. Some of the other sections, like parameters and outputs, are optional, but I want to spend a little time explaining some of the options there. So with parameters, you can have your simple string parameters or a number, but you'll also have a little more capability here in being able to use specific IDs and objects within AWS, like key pair or a VPC ID, that sort of thing. And there's different constraints that you can set along with the parameters as well as descriptions. So in this particular example, we're creating a parameter called key pair, and of course the type is a key pair name, and it allows you to choose which key pair you want to use for getting the instance password once it's created. So once you have your parameter created, then with it back to your resources section, here we have that my EC2 instance that we created earlier, and now we're adding an additional parameter that indicates that the key name for that instance is a reference to the parameter that we created for that. Outputs is another optional section where we can output at the end of the stack some information about some of the resources that were created. In this case, we're going to output the instance ID of that my EC2 instance that was created. Mappings is another optional section I want to talk about a little bit here. Excuse me. The mappings section allows you to match a key to a corresponding set of named values. You can use one or more maps, and then each one has key value sets. So in this case, we just have one map here with different keys and values. Using a specific example here, what we've done is we created a region map, and for each region, we're specifying different keys of 32 and 64, and depending on the key and the region combination, it chooses which AMI to use for the instance. And I'll show a more detailed example of that in a few slides. There are also various functions that you can use within the different sections of the template. You can get attributes. You can find out information about the AZs. You can join different strings together to build a, for instance, put together a file or something you want to include in your instance. There are pseudo parameters that are, you sort of think of them as like a global variable. They're there. You don't have to set up these parameters yourself. They're there ready to be used to get information like what region is this stack running in, what is the name of this stack, etc. So here's that example I was referring to earlier, where inside the resources, we're now referencing the map that we created a few slides ago to say that the image ID is going to use we're going to look up the region that we're in and reference the 32 key within that region to get which AMI to use for our instance. And then, of course, once you create a resource, that resource can be referenced by another resource. In this particular case, we're creating a subnet resource and then specifying that that EC2 instance will be in that subnet. So it references that resource. And by referencing that resource, then CloudFormation knows, okay, that's a prerequisite. I have to create the subnet prior to attempting to create the EC2 instance. The get attribute function I mentioned earlier can be used to get information, other attributes about an instance. In this particular case, we're bringing up the public DNS name for the instance. And now I want to show a little. Okay. So this is actually an EC2 instance that we're looking at here that I created from a CloudFormation stack. And I want to show a couple pieces of how that's set up. So first of all, we'll take a look at, this is SSMS for SQL Server 2016. And you can see if we look at tempdb, you can see the files, multiple files set up. As I was saying before, that can actually now be done as part of the installation, does not have to be done afterwards. So to do that using CloudFormation, what we can do is you simply say you want to create a stack. In this case, I've already created the stack that I want to, the JSON template for the stack that I want to use. I give it a name. We'll just call it my new stack. In this case, so the parameters, again, are optional. You pick whatever you want. Excuse me. In this case, I just said I want to have a password. We can put anything we want in here. I did not create the mapping lookup for the AMI in this particular case. I made it just a text box. You can put any AMI you want, but you could also choose to use the mapping for that. The next parameter here I'm using to determine whether or not we're going to use instant file initialization. Microsoft defaults this to being off, so I decided to default to false as well. But you have the option of enabling that if you want. But I'm going to go ahead and say true. Here's where I'm going to specify which key name I want to use for the to get the instance password. Just taking a look here for a second at the advanced options, you can see this is what I mentioned earlier about the ability to roll back. By default, we leave that on, but you can turn that off if you want to. For instance, if you built your own template and you're trying to troubleshoot because it's not working quite right, you might want to temporarily turn that off so that it doesn't roll back, so that you have the partially created stack that you can go and look at and figure out where it got stuck. And there's the summary of what it's going to do. And we go ahead and create, and it just takes a few minutes. It goes through, and in fact, let's take a look at the actual template, and you can see what it's doing here. It's a little bit long template here. I'm not going to go through every line of this right now, but just to go over some of the sections that we talked about before, you see here we have the parameters. Where here we have the parameter for the key name. Again, in this particular case, I decided just to go with the string to show the difference, whereas in the first one we were doing the type key name, so it knew to give us the drop down there. For this one, I'm just having you type in a string, but defaulting it to a value. Same thing with password. The instant file initialization, we have the allowed values of true and false, but you see I decided I wanted false to be the default. For the resources, we've been talking about EC2 instances, but there's so much more out there beyond that, and when you're configuring your VMs, first you want to have your VPC, your internet gateway, and I didn't really talk about that, but you can see here in the template we have the sections for first I'm creating the VPC, then I create the internet gateway, and you can see here's an example I talked about before where you can reference a previous resource that you created. So in this case, the gateway is referencing the VPC resource. We're creating our AZs. What I'm actually doing with this particular template is I create two machines. I create a public Bastion host for remote desktop, as well as a private host for running SQL Server. So that's why I have the two subnets here for public and private. And we have our routing tables. And again, we're not going to go through every line of this right now. There are great resources online that can help you with this, or if you have specific questions right now, we have some great moderators online. The NAT gateway, Elastic IP. Here's where we're configuring the network for which protocols are allowed through which ports, and with which destinations. So, you know, is a certain service or a certain port open to the internet or only open privately? And just skip ahead a little bit here. And here's where we're creating the Bastion host. Here's where we set up the instance type, what size machine we want it running on, its IP address, and then we set up our SQL machine, which is then on the private subnet. In this case, what I decided to do with the SQL machine is, as part of the resource, I'm identifying a file, and I'm using that join function that I mentioned to basically concatenate this string. Now, if any of you are familiar with SQL Server configuration files for installations, that's basically what I'm building here. I'm building this configuration file, and I'm going to create it. I'm going to create an INI folder in my instance with a file called SQL config INI. And we're setting our admin password, again referencing the password, or sorry, the parameter that we created up top. Once that runs through, this is the file that gets created. If we go back here, you can see here's that INI folder. It creates that SQL config INI file that we talked about and fills in some of the parameters. For instance, like here's the, in this particular case, I had actually, when I created this one earlier, I had changed the password parameter to be pass exclamation 123 instead of period 123, and it went and updated the value here in the INI file. Again, with the SQL 2016, I mentioned this earlier. Here's your options for tempdb. You can specify right here in the installation how many files you want. And oh, here it is. I lost it for a second. And here's the option for the instant file initialization, which I had went ahead and set to true. And that's it for our demo. So here's a list of some additional resources. Again, as I mentioned before, we have some great moderators online right now that can help out and be some resources for you. But here's some additional resources on the web. We have a lot of information on our website. Training. There are virtual training labs. We have, through Quick Labs, there's a whole series of courses you can take on your own time. Again, it's just over the internet. It's a virtual lab for, and there are a lot. These are some of the ones for Windows specifically, but we have a lot of these labs for a lot of different topics. We talked about licensing a little bit. I just want to mention one thing specifically, or bring that up a little more specifically. I mentioned that there's the license included as well as BYOL. It's important to understand that with the BYOL, there are certain restrictions, particularly with Microsoft products. You can use the a dedicated single tenant. If you're using multi-tenant, there are, if you have license mobility through software assurance, there are options there. But most importantly, there's some resources here that are available, and of course you can speak with your Microsoft representative if you have specific questions about your contract. Also, I just want to mention reInvent is coming up. If you haven't already signed up, it's a great opportunity to find out some of this stuff in person. If you're not the type of person who likes to just learn over the web, and you like that personal interaction, great opportunity at reInvent. I definitely recommend you check that out. And that's all. Thank you for your time. We'll now take some time for questions and answers. I just want to mention one last thing. The INI file that I had shown as part of the CloudFormation template, we can make that available later, and we'll be giving you information on how to get that later if you're interested.
I'd like to thank Tom for his time and a great presentation. And I'd like to thank the audience for taking the time to join us today. If you have any comments on our previous and upcoming webinars or suggestions on topics you wish AWS could cover in future webinars, please drop us a line at awswebcasts@amazon.com. Again, that's AWS-webcasts@amazon.com. Your feedback will help us to improve our webinar programming. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, and we will hang out here for another few minutes to answer any other questions that are coming in. Thank you.